Hi, everybody. Today we're going to do a little different video. We're going to do a go live here where we're talking about what is the difference between 13485 and 9001. A lot of people get that 9001 is the quality system standard for general manufacturing, and ISO 1345 is the quality system standard if you have medical devices. But unfortunately, that's about where the end of their knowledge is. They don't know anything more about what the differences are. And this becomes a real problem when you outsource your manufacturing to a company and they have 9001 certification, but they don't know what 1345 has in it, or the certification body they have is not so strong and isn't doing a very thorough job to make sure they're completely compliant with 1345. So you have holes in their qualifications, their quality system. So we're going to show you what to look for when you're looking at their quality system doing a supplier audit, or if you're a 9001 company, what should you be expecting you're going to have to improve in your quality system. So I'm going to actually share a part of the standard that a lot of people never even look at and show you how easy this is to figure out. So here we go. I'm sharing the wrong screen here. There we go. So there we go. And I'm going to remove this banner. So actually, I'll just move this up a little bit. And that'll make it a little bit easier to see. Edit. There we go. Move it up a little bit so you can see a little better. Okay. So on the screen here, I have table B2 at the end of the ISO 1345 standard. At the end of this standard, and I should hide that little thing there so it's on the way. At the end of this standard, it has this table. On the left-hand side is the 9001 clauses. On the right-hand side is 1345. I've highlighted this in yellow and pink. The yellow items are things where there's a gap. The pink items is not just a gap, but it's completely missing a requirement. Okay. And at the very end, stay till the end, or if you have to go and you're not interested, scroll to the end and you'll see some really important stuff, in particular, huge gaps in something you wouldn't realize is such a big gap in the quality systems. So number one here is the scope. So what is different about the scope? The scope of a quality system for 9001 is talking about how you have to have continuous improvement, what requirements you have to meet. Customer satisfaction is important, but it's all about general manufacturing of devices or products in general, whereas ISO 1345 is medical devices, products, and services. And it includes the regulatory requirements. So you have to have a commitment not only to meet customer requirements, but applicable regulatory requirements. So that's one of the key differences in the scope. Another thing that actually comes before clause 1 in the standard is section 0, and I'm going to cover that at the end. That's applicability of clauses. So I'm going to cover that at the end, but it's not in this table, and it's an important difference between the two standards. The next item here is the quality manual. Now, you'll notice on the left-hand side for 9001, there is no mention of a quality manual. That's because when they rewrote the standard, revised it in 2015, they eliminated the requirement for a quality manual. You have to have documented requirements, but you don't specifically have to have a quality manual. So that's still required in 1345, not required in 9001. So that's a complete gap. So if you ask the supplier, you send us a copy of your quality manual, and they don't have one, that's a clue. You got a gap there. And so if they're inspected by an FDA inspector, that's going to be a problem. Okay, a little bit further down the list here, management representative. There is no management representative on the left-hand side. There were some things that were there in the 2008 version of 9001. They're not there anymore. You need somebody to manage your quality system, but it doesn't have to be a management representative. Management representative had very specific roles and responsibilities under 1345 that are not articulated in 9001. So you need to be looking for who is the management rep in your company and where do you have that documented. If they're a 9001 company, you can still have it in a 9001, but it's not a requirement in 9001. It is a requirement in 1345. And then this complete gap now of preventive action. They used to have corrective and preventive action, but in 9001, 2015, they eliminated preventive actions. And they say they use a risk-based approach, but I'm going to talk about that in the end. It's not what you expect for risk management if you're familiar with the risk management requirements for 1345 in medical devices. So you need a preventive action procedure. It doesn't have to be a separate procedure for preventive actions. You could have corrective and preventive action, but you need to have preventive actions included in a 1345 system, and 9001 doesn't have that requirement. So that's a gap. As I scroll down here to the bottom of this first page of the table, we also have the medical device file. Obviously, in a 9001 system, it's for general quality systems. You're not going to mention medical devices, so the need for a medical device file is completely non-existent. So that's why that's pink. Same thing for the design and development file. The design and development file, currently the FDA thinks of that as a design history file. It's all the history from the beginning to the end of your design. The medical device file might be just the current DMR under the current system. When the FDA in February switches over to incorporating by reference ISO 1345, the definition of the DHF disappears, the definition of the DMR disappears, and they just use these two. And you have to go to either ISO 1345, which really doesn't spell out what should be in them, or more likely go to the IMDRF guidance document. So that's the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, has guidance documents about what should be in technical files or technical documentation, and it's supposed to be harmonized over many countries, including the US. So that's where you might want to look for what should be included. But in general, the medical device file should be the current version of your product and should be maintained as a living record of how to make this product, and usually it's an index. Whereas the design and development files talks about the original design and development and the design changes, and that could also be an index, though usually it's a chronological record in a collection of binders or a collection of virtual folders and files. The next one is product realization in planning. So there is a planning section in section 4 of ISO 1345, and there's a planning section in 7.1 of 1345. The planning section in the beginning is quality system planning, which is in both standards. The planning and product realization in 1345, it's a little bit different. Yes, the operational planning and control is the same, but the risk management note that says refer to 14971 for risk management requirements, that's not in 9001, and I'll talk about that more later. Okay, we're at the end of this table. Now we're going to go on to the next page. So we have the design and development section is different. They still have design and development in 9001, and that's actually where it originally came from. Believe it or not, they actually copied verbatim from 9001 1994 version. They copied it in Health Canada because they like to incorporate international standards, leverage that instead of coming up with their own requirements. And then the FDA made design controls required in 1996, and they said republish with permission from Health Canada. So that waterfall diagram that you've seen that was actually developed back in 1910, that was copied with permission from Health Canada, who copied all the wording from the 9001 1994. So the basic concepts of waterfall are the same, but when they revised things again in 2015, they took out some of the same wording, so they don't match up so similarly anymore. So there are different things that they added in 2016 to the 1345. They took things out of 9001, and it made them a lot different in terms of design controls. The FDA is looking for statistical justifications for verification, justifications for validation. They want you to have independent reviewers. They want you to have traceability from hazards to inputs to outputs to your documentation of the verification and validation. Those things are just not requirements in 9001. They're much more general and vague about how you would meet the requirement. So very prescriptive requirements in 1345, not so much in 9001. And last but not least, so I cover kind of these first three. Traceability is different. The statistical justifications, the lack of independent reviewers, those are differences. You're required to have a procedure for design controls. You're required to have a procedure for changes. But you're also required in 1345 to have a procedure for design transfer. And design transfer doesn't even exist now in 9001. So that one is the biggest difference in the design section. And it's really important when you're transferring the design that you came up with to a contract manufacturer. How are you making sure that that manufacturer has procedures for incoming inspection, setting up a router or a production batch? How are they going to inspect the part? How are they going to build their batch record? How are they going to do final inspection? How are they going to ship the part, package the part, store the part? All those things are part of your building your design transfer file so you know how to make this part in production. And none of that requirement exists in 9001. They just say, more vaguely, come up with your design and development controls, and they don't talk about the operational controls. That's back under 7.1 in the operational planning, which I think is 8.1 in 9001. So it's just not the same. The next thing here is this verification purchase product. They both talk about when you're outsourcing things in purchasing them, you're going to have purchasing information, and you're going to indicate what things the supplier is responsible for and what things you're responsible for and what documentation needs to be provided. But they don't specifically talk about acceptance activities. And that's something that the FDA requires. It's in 1345 under clause 7.43, but it's not included in 9001 specifically. So that's another one that you have to include. When you're talking about this next one here, so validation of processes for production and service provision, that item is completely not in there. They do mention the word, I think, validation in there, but they don't really go into any detail. There's nothing in there, of course, about sterilization, because you wouldn't have that except for sterile products that would be devices or IVDs maybe. And then in addition to that, you don't have anything about sterile barrier packaging. There aren't specific validation of the sterilization process, and you don't have validation of automated processes. There are companies that will validate processes, but they also do other types of ways of controlling manufacturing processes to get some consistent product. They might use very tight tolerances. They might use 100% inspection. They might rely on statistics more in trending. So validation is something that is a little bit unique to the medical device industry in many respects, and certainly different from, I accidentally hit the wrong button when I moved the screen, sorry. So we are missing those things in 9001, but we have them in 1345. The next item here is traceability. For traceability, you don't have the UDI requirements. So 21 CFR 830. We also have, and that 2 is very poor. In addition to the UDI requirements, you also have traceability for implants. You're not going to have implants in 9001. So those are requirements that are not included. Traceability is, identification is, but the specific requirements for implants is missing. Installation activities, even though you could install non-medical devices, that's not specifically called out. Service is mentioned, but the prescriptive requirements about doing an analysis of service and determining if corrective actions are required, and doing a statistical analysis of that service data, and having records and procedures, not all spelled out as required by the FDA or other regulators. Complaint handling was added in 2016, Clause 822. They took what was vaguely mentioned as customer feedback and customer communication in determining when it might need corrective actions or might involve non-conforming product that needs to be returned to you. And they made it very prescriptive to make it as close to what the FDA's requirements were as possible in 2016. But they didn't do that over on the 9001 side. So the complaint handling requirements are very prescriptive and they need to be followed for your complaint process, not in 9001. So you're going to have all kinds of suppliers that don't have a complaint handling process if they have 9001 that meets the requirements. So if they get inspected, that's going to be a 483 right away. This next one is 21 CFR 803. So not to be confused with 830. 803 is the regulatory reporting for the FDA. This is the medical device reporting. For Europe, it would be vigilance. For Canada, it would be incident reporting. So you have to make sure that you cover the specific requirements for reporting of serious injuries or death or something that could lead to that. None of that exists for a non-medical product, so they're not going to be in 9001. The next item on the list there is actions in response to non-conforming product detected after delivery. This is the recall clause. So this is going to be 21 CFR 806, corrections and removals. Also Part 7, which talks about enforcement in the FDA's classification of recalls in Class 1, 2, and 3 recalls. That's not spelled out. They still would have return of product and correction and removal of product, but they don't have specific regulations or how it has to be done and documented and reported. So those are unique requirements to 1345 that are not in 9001. They wouldn't be as big of a deal for your contract manufacturers because your contract manufacturer is unlikely to recall things, but your company is. So you need to make sure you have that. Then we have complaint handling is repeated again. Feedback is mentioned here. Feedback, we want to talk about not just reactive feedback, but the proactive post-market surveillance feedback. So that's something that's not covered in 9001, but is covered in medical devices. So we go on to the next page here. So nothing on this particular page. So that covers all the things that I was talking about, but and I hope, yes, here we go. I'm going to move it to another screen so you can see it properly. Here's the 9001 standard, and I typed up here risk management, and it only occurs 3 times. So that's the first time it appears in 0.5 risk-based thinking. They say ISO 3100 provides guidelines on formal risk management, which can be appropriate in certain organizational contexts. That's not the standard medical devices have to use for risk management. It's a very different one that's more about business risks and environmental risks. When we go to Appendix 4, subsection 4, we have a risk-based approach. They go into more detail, but at the very end of it, they say, although risks and opportunities have been determined and addressed, there is no requirement for a formal risk management or a documented risk management process. So they're saying right in 9001, you don't have to have a documented process, but in 1345 you do. And in some countries like Europe, you have a very prescriptive requirement about how you have to do it that even deviates slightly from 14971, going above and beyond what 14971 requires. So if you are doing medical devices, ignore what this is in here. And of course, any medical device manufacturer that's a contract manufacturer that is 9001, they're going to have to upgrade their requirements for risk management to comply with 14971, not just have a process FMEA and say, that's our risk management. That's not enough. A risk analysis, particularly just a process risk analysis, is not adequate for a risk-based approach in a medical device company. you need to follow 14971. And if you're doing software, you should actually be familiar with the IEC TR 80002-2. I'm sorry, 80002-1, and it might be ISO TR, not IEC, but it's the standard for telling you how to apply risk management to software. So how to apply 14971 to software is what that standard's about. And so that's what you should really be following. And they actually have 6 pages explaining the types of risks that you see with software. So lots more information about risk management, not included whatsoever in 9001. They actually contradict what's in 1345 directly. And then that last thing that I was saying, so this was the biggie, the risk management. There's one more big difference here, and that's when we get to the topic of exclusions. So it only appears twice in the entire document. Once here, this international standard no longer makes specific reference to exclusions when determining the applicability of requirements. So they don't use that anymore. The 9001, when they switched in 2015, they eliminated that. It was a bit confusing because the rules for 1345 said that you can only exclude design, and all the other clauses in 7, product realization and planning, could be non-applicable depending on the type of product. In 2016, they expanded that to allow it to not just be product realization, which would be clause 7, but now it also includes all of 6, and all of 8 can also be non-applicable, but still the exclusion would only be for design, and that would be if you outsource it or somebody else does that and it's not something you do. The 6, 7, and 8 can be not applicable. So you have to look at exclusions, and basically the same things being said earlier in the document, not use see Annex 8.4 for clarification of applicability. So they talk about some of the differences here, the major differences they made between 2008 and 2015. So products and services, 1345 did the same thing. This went the complete opposite direction. Documentation records, now documented information. Hence, we don't have quality manuals anymore. So there's a lot of big changes that were made here. In 9001 going to the 2015 version, and it took it very far away from what the 1345 requirements are. And so we see a lot of companies that are suppliers that are not meeting the requirements and don't do well in inspections. So you should be aware of that and maybe have your own checklist or have very qualified auditors that know the 1345 requirements doing a process approach audit of those suppliers to qualify them and identify any gaps before you get into an arrangement where they're manufacturing your product and they might be inspected. So that's what the differences are between 1345 and 9001. I hope this was helpful to you. I hope you learned that where you can go get that cheat sheet, that comparison guide at the end of 1345. And I hope you will attend our live streaming training this Friday at noon, where we cover the stage 1 clauses of 1345. And then next Friday, we're going to cover the stage 2 clauses of 1345. But that's free refresher training on 1345 for you. And this is free training as well. So hope the free training is helping you out. See you later. Bye-bye.